Well, it's a privilege to be with you amongst old friends in conversation and amongst many of you whose work I've looked up to for so many years. As I understand it, my task here is not just to present my own ideas on the topic, but to represent something of the ideas that emerged out of one of these multi-year workshops that both John and Michael alluded to. The particular one that I've been entrusted to speak on is the emergence of spirit, soul, and mind. It took many years. The first thing that had to emerge was what we meant by those topics, actually. And I should say before I start that when given a task this broad with a time this short, the options are to completely disregard the time limit. I'm not going to do that. Michael's wagging his finger at me. To go deep on one topic that doesn't represent the whole enterprise, or to go shamelessly broad. And I will say from the start, I'm going to do the latter. So apologies for those of you who may be specialists in these areas. But I should say, first of all, that what we did was wrestle with framing questions. I mean, first of all, what do we mean by spirit, for example, much not to mention soul, mind, or other entities. And the starting point of conversation for spirit was just that it's the animating principle of life. In fact, spirit itself, from the Latin spiritus, meaning breath, soul, from the Greek psyche, meaning breath. So in some sense, we were talking about the relationship of life to natural processes in the material world. And questions that arose in terms of framing questions, first of all, the relationship of matter and spirit. There are a number of questions here. First of all, I mean, and these are topics of much discussion these days, so apologies, although I want to put out the framing questions then to set a context for discussing evolution. The question of emergence, is the property of the whole or to the property of living systems, are they reducible to or calculable from the participating parts? Of course, this is an ancient question. Aristotle debated this with Empedocles, who suggested that the roots and the stems of plants were composed of fire and water, respectively, going up and going down. And Aristotle argued, no, it has to be more than the parts, because there needs to be an entelechy, an integrating principle where the end of the organism was within itself, keeping the disparate parts coherent. And more recently, of course, setting off many debates here was the Cartesian view, who sided with Empedocles. In his Discourse and Methods, Descartes said that if we possessed a thorough knowledge of all the parts of the seed of any species of animal, we could, from that alone, by reasons entirely mathematical and certain, deduce the whole figure and conformation of each of its members. So, I mean, one of the questions we discussed over 5 years from various perspectives is the extent to which this is true. But an even more radical question emerges, and that is to say, does it make any sense to talk of a whole? That is to say, one question is the properties of a whole explainable by the properties of the constituent parts? But another question is, do wholes, in particular life itself, have properties at all that are distinct from or not present in constituent parts? So not too far from here, it was Ernst Haeckel at Jena who made this striking statement around the time of Darwin. We thus arrive at the conviction of the last importance that all natural bodies with which we are acquainted are equally endowed with life, gleichmäßig belebt sind, that the distinction between living and dead matter does not exist. So we explored to what extent there are properties of living systems. Set aside the question of emergence, by the way, the causal processes by which properties emerge, and just ask, are there properties of living systems that are not evident in non-living systems? Lots of proposals came up, many of which could be linked under the rubric of target orientation or teleology. Many properties of living systems, homeostasis, development, metabolism, for example, appear to be target-oriented in ways that abiotic systems don't seem to evidence. And then lastly, we might ask, and here's what I want to focus mostly on, are there directional trends in the history of life in terms of the constitution or possible amplification of these processes? It's now almost 50 years ago that Michael Polanyi published an essay called In Science, called Life's Irreducible Complexity. And he laid out a vision for this in which he says, if we accept as I do the view that living beings form a hierarchy in which each higher level represents the distinctive principle that harnesses the levels below it while being itself irreducible to its lower principles, then the evolutionary sequence gains a new and deeper significance. We can recognize then a strictly defined progression rising from the inanimate level to ever higher additional principles of life. And by the way, for the last 45 years or so, this view of Polanyi has been at best overlooked and at worst derided, but there's some recent work that has brought it back onto the table. And I want to discuss this in kind of three installments. First of all, evolution, spirit, and what we might call the organismic processes of life, the phylogenetic proliferation of life, and brief comments on the moral principles or the emergence of morality in life. Firstly, with respect to processes of life, of course, the fundamental debate here is that between mechanism and vitalism. I actually don't want to evaluate the scientific merits of that. That would be way too much to do. But I do want to make a historical comment here. And this is one of the things I learned from our time together. It seems to me that in the history of science, with the possible exception of the invention out of cloth of the flat earth debate, that there may be no episode, at least in the biological sciences, that has been more represented in more melodramatic, if not outright fictitious, combat between the villains and heroes. And this so in two ways. First of all, there's this ad hominem dichotomization between what's been called mechanism and vitalism. Mechanism is rather straightforward, but actually vitalism, it turns out that there's no one single beast. In fact, Arthur Lovejoy in Science, the turn of the century, wrote a fascinating article called Varieties of Vitalism, which has been pretty much overlooked for the last 100 years. But the vitalism includes at least a range of proposals, from a metaphysical proposal that there's a vital substance, a separate substance, or a more modest naturalistic animating force like gravity, or teleological or indirected causal properties, or what might be called Lebensautonomy, that there are principles or laws of life that aren't reducible to laws of physics, but there are no special forces or substances. Michael Polanyi, I think, seemed to argue for this, to most modestly that actually there are laws of physics that describe life, but we haven't discovered them yet. And Schroeder seems to argue for this in his book, What is Life? So there's this dramatic range of alternatives to standard mechanism that has often collapsed into the one most thoroughly repudiated metaphysical proposal for a separate substance. But even more interesting than that, there's been in virtually all the textbooks, and I have to say I was just nursed on this as a student in biology and taught it for many years myself, there's a theoretical misrepresentation of this tension. And it turns out to be important in how we construe evolutionary theory to this debate. If I just take one example, spontaneous generation. There's been a connection of the winners in the debate, so that spontaneous generation is connected in most of the textbooks with vitalism, and Pasteur is represented in his famous experiments, which are claimed to have refuted spontaneous generation. By the way, they didn't. It lived on after Pasteur. Also refuting vitalism, but actually the opposite, the very opposite is the case. Spontaneous generation was reviewed to be a necessarily entailment of mechanism, because mechanism viewed life as simply a constellation of inanimate parts. And if that's the case, if you put the parts together in their proper stoichiometries, you ought to get life. Pasteur was a vitalist, and his arguments against spontaneous generation were done in defense of vitalism, not in defiance of vitalism. And secondly, a number of treatments then go on to argue that spontaneous generation was associated with theism, and that many religious people advocated spontaneous generation to defend theism. But actually the reverse is entirely the case. And thirdly, most relevant to our time here today, in terms of evolution, spontaneous generation is and evolution are all often linked in the following way. It's true, actually. In fact, there was a very complicated relationship between the early advocates of Darwin and spontaneous generation. They weren't sure what to do with it, but Huxley was tremendously influential in getting the results of Pasteur into textbooks. And in doing so, it was, in fact, a vote against spontaneous generation. But in so doing, in the spirit of the times, that was seen as conciliant with vitalism. So it's not clear at all that the earlier interpretations of Darwin were anti-vitalistic. In fact, at the end of the Origin, Darwin talks about life being breathed in to one form of several, and that was in the first edition. From the second edition on, all the way through the seventh, he added the Creator, breathed in by the Creator into one form or several. So it doesn't appear to be the case that evolution, at least initially, took any kind of stand on vitalism at all. And if we were to infer a de facto stand by Huxley's and Darwin's perspective, it might be in favor of it. Mark Kirshner has written a wonderful book recently that engages some of these issues. The book was foreshadowed by a review article in Cell a number of years ago. And as wonderful as this work is, he also incarnates this error. So in his Cell paper, he says, vitalism was progressively undermined by Fuller's synthesis of urea, Pasteur's inability to demonstrate spontaneous generation, as well as by Darwin's Origin of the Species. Actually, the last 2 points just aren't right. Okay, I'm going to skip over epigenesis and talk about the second topic, organismic proliferation. Evolutionary theories impact our understanding of the organism in a couple of ways. And the first way has been amply discussed in the context of the deconstruction of the organism. The reductive teleology by which organisms are seen as genes' ways of reproducing themselves. Here it's important to point out that although there is a reductionism here, there actually is not an extrusion of teleology. Organisms are viewed as for something, and it's for the gene. But in addition to reductive teleology, there's also what you might call an ambiguous ontology in terms of what constitutes the origin itself, the organism itself. I think this is Richard Dawkins' maybe most fascinating image, if not his own idea of the extended phenotype or the extended organism, or the skinless organism. And on the one hand, this notion makes permeable, if not dissolves, the boundaries of organisms. But on the other hand, it actually opens them to expansion. So once this boundary becomes not so clearly discrete, we get the possibilities of superorganisms or aggregates functioning as organisms. And that brings up the next and most substantial topic I want to mention, and that's directionality and evolution with respect to this notion of the constitution of organisms and individuals. So one kind of directionality in evolution entails phenotypic trends, and we have lots of examples of these kinds of trends: increase in body size, homeostatic precision, the cellular complexity, or other measures of complexity. There are debates over the extent to which these represent trends, and if they do represent trends, over the extent to which they're active or passive trends. Trends favored by natural selection or trends that just represent the passive diffusion away from a minimum wall. And often the latter option is described as mere passive diffusion away from a minimum wall. I think the mere is misleading, because in order to have diffusion, you have to have, first of all, a driving force, and secondly, you have to have possibility space that is conducive to such diffusion. So at the very least, we have a cosmos that's favorable to these trends. But underlying these trends, there's a deeper trend, and this has to do with recent work that's been done in the major evolutionary transitions. Martin, in his wonderful talk last night, referred to a number of these. There are different taxonomies for these transitions, but they include things like taking one enzyme that functions as information in enzymes, separating functions into two, gene and enzyme, aggregating, replicating molecules into compartmentalized populations or protocells, taking a single replicator and aggregating it into something like a chromosome, prokaryotic cells to eukaryote, protists to multicells, asexual to sexual reproduction, solitary to social or eusocial animals, and lastly, primate to human sociality. And by the way, each of these transitions, oftentimes within them, entails an increase of the properties we're looking at. So if we look at multicellularity, for example, there are degrees of multicellularity. By the time we get to vertebrates, there's a radical increase, not just in the number, but the types of cells. So you move up the phylogenetic continuum. Parental care, there's a continuum here as well that is described by what biologists call R and K strategies, greater investment in a fewer number of organisms. And all these trends then we can describe in terms of common themes that are shared by many, and in some cases all of them. And first of all, there's a modified transmission of information, either in terms of how the information is packaged or how the information is instantiated itself. Martin last night mentioned the origin of human language. And in fact, human language then, more recently, has even developed, and initially this was intrasomatic. Language only existed in people's brains, but now there are extrasomatic modes of storing information in human culture. Also, cooperation is process and product. That is, again, Martin mentioned that cooperation is necessary to achieve these transitions. But what the transitions entail is increased scales of cooperation, which often involve functional specialization. And this specialization increases the efficiency, and because roles are differentially assigned, may also decrease the benefit of defections. And this, in many of the transition issues, results in obligate interdependence, which many biologists have called evolutionary transitions in individuality. That is to say, the individual is reformulated at a higher level of scale. Richard Michaud speaks of transforming our understanding of life as the realization that evolution occurs not only through mutational change in populations, but also during evolutionary transitions in individuality, when groups of individuals become so integrated they evolve into higher level individual. Indeed, the major landmarks in the diversification in life and hierarchical organization of the living world are consequences of a series of ETIs. Now lastly, and in my view, just most excitingly, all these thematic consistencies may be seen to result in what we might call biotic intensification, or to use the words of the title that I was given, the rise of spirit. That is to say, the very qualities of life, the ability to maintain an constant interior state, homeostasis, sensory acuity, and being aware of the external environment, behavioral flexibility, metabolic precision. All of these qualities may, in fact, be increased. The philosopher of biology, Hans Jonas, over evolutionary time, spoke of what he called the ascent of soul. And actually, I regret that this phrase has been ridiculed since he wrote, but there's a sense in which it may be appropriate. Recall that Polanyi spoke of the progressive intensification of the higher principles of life over evolutionary time. One of the coolest things that's happened in the last few years is a colleague of Martin's, Carl Sigmund, and Urs Zothmori, in an article in Nature a few years back, referred to this very quote by Polanyi. And they say, this progress, referring to Polanyi's quote, nowadays described as a series of major transitions in evolution, is often due to the emergence of new units. So my task was to refer to evolution and the emergence of spirit, and I think there's a really fascinating recent work. If you take spirit as somehow reflecting the animating principles of life itself, in which this actually increases over evolutionary time. And I think I'm going to close in order to honor my time commitment by just mentioning this last topic and not, unfortunately, analyzing it. But I do want to say that this last, at each of these transitions, the task is to facilitate and stabilize cooperation in the face of defection. And one of the proposals for morality is that it is an adaptation for doing this at a scale of cooperation that's not evident in other organisms. In fact, Hugh Wilson in 1975, Sociobiology, referred to the scale of human cooperation as, quote unquote, the culminating mystery of all biology. An early proposal for how morality might do this was actually made by William James in his fabulous, intriguing essay, Will to Believe, in which I think he anticipated game theory by at least a generation. James talks of robbers boarding a train where there are enough people on the train that could overcome the robbers if they could overcome the collective action problem. But no, because nobody believes they will, nobody does. And he says, if everybody did, there would be no robbers. And he concludes by saying, there are then cases where a fact cannot come at all unless a preliminary faith exists in its coming. Faith in a fact can help create the fact. So what many proposals for morality do, adaptationist proposals at least, is they create a social system that overcome these collective action problems by, in a sense, creating faith in a fact. I'll leave 2 questions on the table that I can't discuss. Michael's still smiling, not frowning yet, thankfully. But one question is the extent to which adaptationist proposals for morality are actually empirically sufficient. This is still a big debate in biology these days. Francisco Ayala would say that they are not. Morality is not an adaptation, it's a spandrel or a byproduct. And the second question is actually a more philosophical one. If we have an evolutionary account that proposes a causal genesis for morality, and by the way, even if that morality isn't strictly self-interested, so set that aside, it raises epistemic problems for moral realism. And the argument goes like this. I'm not going to assess it. I'll just put it on the table and leave it. It begins with a counterfactual. Michael Ruth suggests that if there's evolutionary advantage to moral behaviors, then imagine a creatures living in a universe where there were no moral reality, but natural selection would still create the dispositions to believe in those things. And therefore, if we have a causal genealogy of a belief that explains the origin of the belief without reference to the truth of the belief, it doesn't mean the belief is false, but it does subvert our warrant for confidence in our grounds for believing it to be true. So, thank you very much for your attention.
We have 25 minutes for questions. So may I invite yourself and your home institution as you ask the question. Janet.
Should be.
Janet Soskis, is this on? Yeah? Okay, University of Cambridge. Thank you very much for a fascinating session. And Jeff, you had to speed through that last part. But one of the things that you were discussing in this teleology was this move towards more and more collective enterprises. And I wondered, just maybe unfair, but is that in any element in tension with the kind of eschatological vision that you, John, were enunciating, where you said, I am the God of Abraham discrete, Isaac discrete, and Jacob. We've got a God who loves intense particularity. Is there some, I know you don't necessarily have to pull all your projects together, but is there some way, this is something in historical theology that has been very important. One only thinks of Dante's Paradiso. Are people there more real than ever they were in real life, or are they all wrapped into an amorphous love of God where their individuality dissolves? I suppose it's really a question for Jeff about where your project's going.
Well, two quick comments on that. I mentioned this quote by E.O. Wilson where he speaks about the scale of human cooperation being, quote unquote, the culminating mystery of all biology. But the reason he found it to be such a mystery is not just the numeric scale of cooperation. The social insects exceed us in that, but that we have managed to expand our scale not at the cost of individuality, unlike the social insects. So that's the first answer. And one of the things that we might see in a number of these transitions is a certain relinquishment of autonomy, but not always with the complete loss of individuality. And secondly, just a quick comment, a number of my colleagues kind of run the tape forward of evolutionary directionality and argue for some sort of eschatological end to the evolutionary process itself. And I just like to say that while these trends might reflect something we would call good to the extent that we could think biotic potency or intensification is good, it's not a moral good. That at each stage there's the possibility of defection. At each stage actually there's the possibility of greater experienced distress at defections. So the process itself and the beings that it originates are morally underdetermined. And my own view is that what we have over evolutionary time is the evolution of a creature, a morally aware creature that is in need of redemption.
The question about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I mean, they're significant not only as individuals, but as the foundational figures for continuing tradition.
I saw a question there. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jörg Hüfner, a physicist from Heidelberg, and my question addresses mostly to John Polkinghorne about this question of continuity and discontinuity. I mean, I'm saying it in simple words, and you say, well, there is no material continuity of a human being, but there is a continuity which you called information.
Right.
And and it's just this, what I want to have a little bit more precise definition is, because information has also some meaning in physics, mathematics, and so on. Yeah. And there, information is stored. My question is, where is that's the first question, where is your information stored about the person who had died? And the second question is related to it. How do you know that this information does not underlie the second law of thermodynamics? That means that also the information decays. I mean, in our world, information decays. But your information, in quote unquote, does not decay. I understand. I suppose.
Well, I did confess to waving my hands, and we are playing with the toys of thought. And if information is to play anything like the role I was hoping, it will have to rise far, far and above the banalities of physical information theory and so on. That's the first thing I'd say. And we don't know how to do that, but that seems to me the right direction. I like to quote that remark of Thomas Nagel's, that when we talk about human nature, we are engaged in pre-Socratic flailings around. I mean, the pre-Socratics had this wonderful idea there's one substance out of which the world is made. They didn't quite get it right, but they were proto-elementary particle physicists 2,500 years too early to know about quarks. And the other thing I would say is that the information I was talking about, of course, decays with the body, and all physical information in the old creation decays, but I believe the parts that are relevant are preserved in the mind of God, where things do not decay.
Thank you. Do we have further questions? Niels.
Yes, thank you. My name is Niels Gregersen from Copenhagen University. I'm a systematic theologian, and I have also a question to John Polkinghorne in this regarding information, because this has to do with the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that I think that one will have to take on board if one is to play with the idea of informational patterns as being the carriers of continuity. And I think it's a magnificent idea, and so I'm not asking this question from outside, but more from inside, because I think that in a sense it's not just about storage of information. It has to do something with remembrance, and remembrance always is something that goes on actively. So I think there must be some discussion about how the concept of information is changing when we go from physical information, which is about making differences and storing differences, and biological information, which has to be about encoding rules for further procedures, and then something like remembering and communication, because it must be enacted, and it must retain the social nexus from which the information was taken. So in a sense, I don't want to have my life stored. I want to have it remembered in its social relationships to other people, in the Christian parlance, to the community of saints.
Well, thank you, Niels. Yes, I agree, of course, that information is not just the raw material of archives in that sense. And I think when I say the human pattern is kept in the memory of God, I think that keeping could be a dynamic keeping. It could involve the beginnings of salvific process. To use a banal analogy, it could involve debugging some of the information and so on. So yes, I think positive information is a very helpful thing. Could I ask somebody to get me a glass of water? It would be very helpful if somebody could. Michael.
Yeah, just a few remarks to Niels and also to Jörg Höfner. I used to say to our students, you are not just a reference point, as theories of self-consciousness often pretended. You are an ocean or a world, and not only of memory, but also of imagination. So it's not just the storage in the memories, it's also the imagination of that. And I think for the spirit, it is crucial. The power of reaching out to unseen realities, but realities. And I think another point that helps us in moving toward a little bit to your question, Jörg, is the nature of love. Because in love, I always try to understand it as a free, creative, and even joyful self-withdrawal in favor of others. So it's a counter-movement to the Sarkic element of self-sustenance. And the interesting thing is that here you do not lose, you gain. Yeah, it's a counterintuitive phenomenon. You withdraw in favor of others in a joyful way so that they flourish, and you do not lose, no, you win, you gain. So here we have phenomena which help us to strive forward to the reality of the spirit and the moving beyond our self-sustaining processes. And one could very nicely correlate it with also moral communication, where we try to give and withdraw respect and try to steer our mutual information, but this is still sustenance of the individual. But with love and spirit, we also have ennoblement, we have the moving beyond just sustenance. And I think these are the complicated boundaries where we have to gain new insights in order to understand these higher types of realities.
John, did you wish to continue?
No, that was fine. Thank you very much.
Fine, thank you. Antje, you had a question.
Yes, my name is Antje Jackelén. I'm a systematic theologian from Lund, Sweden. I was so intrigued by this reconceptualization of the soul, and I think it's long overdue, because so many good energies in the field have been trapped in other projects, and I think this needs to be done. But I'm wondering whether there is not a lot of theological homework we can skip over before we get ready for dialoguing on this. I mean, when you said the soul as the real me, you have such a heavy legacy of essentialist thinking about this. This is the kernel, this is something that is given from the very beginning, and so on. And now I think we are much more into trying to wrap our minds around what it means to maybe look at the soul as an emerging pattern. And what really does that do to our theology? I mean, there's a lot, I think, that's going to be revolutionized in theology if we really take this very seriously. And then the other part of the question would be, does this in the end boil down to how we understand time or not understand time? Because it seems to me that the issue of continuity and discontinuity is so heavily bound to our inability to imagine that apart from linear time. But how can we, any idea how we can expand on that, how we can wrap our minds around these two things, the emerging pattern and trying to imagine this apart from the concept of linear time?
Well, thank you, Andrew. That raises some very interesting issues. Yes, I mean, I think at first sight, some of this talk about information-bearing pattern sounds a bit like a revamping of the Thomistic idea of the soul as the form of the body. But I think the main difference is that it seems to me that the Thomistic idea has very much a sort of given, unchanging character to the soul. But what I'm trying to grope towards is very much a developmental idea. Human personhood is something that we grow into, and incidentally that has a number of interesting implications for ethical thinking in various areas, not least embryo research. That's a separate issue. So I think that's a helpful thing to say. I also want to say that I think not only is it intrinsic to human beings to be embodied in some form, so that resurrection is the Christian hope, not spiritual survival, but also I think it's intrinsic to us that we are temporal beings. And I think there will not only there will be matter in the world to come, but there will be time in the world to come. I think salvific process is an unfolding process, and I don't think that its fulfillment is the timeless beatific vision, as so much Christian thinking has thought in the past, but it is the unending exploration of the inexhaustible riches of the divine nature, progressively unveiled in the life of the world to come. So I think that I think the role of time is intrinsic to some form of time. Is intrinsic to human nature.
Yes.
Yes, this is for Professor Schloss. I'm Chris Impey from the University of Arizona. I'm an astronomer. So your nice summary of the transitions in the history of life and the sense of increasing organizational and operational complexity and so on. So this is a very general question. In your sense of definition of the word spirit, to me, looking at the nature of life's transitions through 3 billion years, it seems a pure continuum, and there are organizational elements, you know, like we've just discovered that the human organism is a subset of a microbial biome that outranks us and outflanks us and outnumbers us and influences most of our major components and major diseases and so on. So what is there a singular transition, or is there a break in this continuum? Because the evolution of organisms on the earth does not seem to present a place where some new element is introduced that's singular to some species or some subset of species that we might call spirit.
The easy answer is I don't know. But I also don't want to fall into the seashore problem, which is to say that although the distinction between the sea and the seashore isn't discrete, that there's no difference between an ocean and a beach. So I actually don't think that it is true that living organisms lack properties any properties which constituent parts don't have. Rocks don't conduct homeostasis. They may change weather over time, but they don't have a developmental trajectory. They don't have a metabolism. And the metabolism is not just a series of chemical reactions, but it's a controlled and targeted series of chemical reactions. So I'm not sure where the dividing line is. Martin last night mentioned a crucial dividing line exists between molecules which are capable of self-replication. That's certainly a threshold, although I don't know that we would call self-replicating molecules living organisms. Maybe not a clear dividing line, at least in the origin of life, but living systems have properties that non-living systems do, and I think all of them share a feature that we might think of in terms of target-oriented or goal-oriented activity. And over the phylogenetic history, the capacity to do that has increased.
Yes, we have another question from the left.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. What do you think?
Excuse me, could you just identify?
Oh, yes, Stephen Post. Thank you, Stony Brook. I'm not certain of this, but it sounds as though the panel, for the most part, is committed to what might be called a non-reductive physicalism of some sort. However, what I don't hear you addressing in a hard way is the perennial philosophy, to think of Aldous Huxley as an example of an articulator of that. There's a lot of good philosophy of mind, there's a lot of good theology, there's a lot of good neuroscience, and even some good physics, where people take the idea of non-local mind seriously. There's been a certain kind of ascendance, I think, in the last 5 years of some moderated substance dualism. At some level, can we take that notion seriously, or should we just, as certainly Dr. Polkinghorne and others have suggested, just kind of assume a non-reductive physicalism? I mean, it seems to me that it's a very complicated question, and people are on both sides of it.
I personally don't much like the phrase non-reductive physicalism, because I think it has a slight it tends to be even-handed. It tends to give a priority to the physical. I prefer dual aspect monism as a way of talking about things, so there is both mind and matter, though there is a single substance of the world, and the mind and matter represent that substance encountered in different circumstances. And I think we are just beginning to see in science the study of mildly complex systems which display astonishing holistic properties you wouldn't have guessed from the bonus, the spontaneous generation of patterns of dynamical order, both in computer modeling, but also more interestingly in simple physical dissipative systems. I think it strongly suggests that there are probably discoveries to be made in nature about holistic laws of nature, which complement, don't replace, of course, the reductionist constituent laws of nature, but complement them. I suppose that would be something of a move in the direction that you're hinting at.
Michael, you also wish
Yeah.
to comment.
Yes. I cannot find myself in non-reductive physicalism at all, I have to say. I think we should not let our insistence on realism, the interest on realism, be confused with naturalism and physicalism. And I think what many of us share in common is that we see that our cultures are trapped in monistic, dual, and dualistic types of thinking, and that we have to explore richer forms of conceptuality. So when we tried to develop a multidimensional anthropology, it was trying to get out of these dualistic forms. And even in Paul, we didn't work with Pauline anthropology because you had this feeling, spirit, flesh, dualism, but it's finally the dualism of finitude and eternity. And already when you look closer to even flesh, our heart is of flesh. According to the flesh, we are Jesus out of the house of David. And when you look at spirit, mere spiritual relation to God, be careful. The tongue speakers have a mere spiritual relation. So you see that he already qualifies these dualistic approaches. And I think also when we started to deal with the law scholars, concepts of law and science, legal studies and theology, we tried to find new ways that we can get out of traps of dualism. So non-reductive physicalism is a little too short for many of the projects I have been involved.
Martin.
Martin Novak, Harvard University. I have a question maybe that is addressed to all four panelists. So I'm fascinated by observing how the God concept has changed over time from the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New Testament, then bringing in Greek philosophy and then the God of the Church Fathers. So my question is, how has the understanding of modern physics that was mentioned by Professor Polkinghorn yesterday, that we have a new logic there, actually changed the way how we think about God these days, or the discoveries in biology? So is it that we are still having the same idea of God that St. Thomas would have had, or how has it changed and how might it change these days?
Well, I think that it has been a pretty fundamental theological principle that all human thinking about God is subject necessarily to change and correction. The infinite can never be adequately grasped by finite minds, hence the warnings of apophatic theology about overconfidence in that respect. We know that ultimately every image of God, other I think than the incarnate Son of God, is an idol which is eventually to be smashed. And so it's not surprising that there are developments in theological thinking, and like all developments, some are helpful and some are not so helpful. But I don't think we should feel troubled about change in this sort of sense. I mean, God isn't just a simple given idea that we can nail down and use as an unquestionable criterion for all our subsidiary thinking.
For me, a great change happened when I did research on the spirit, different notions, philosophical, theological, and then 20 years ago I published a book on the Holy Spirit and the biblical traditions. And then you see that a lot of spirit reflections were caught in merely numinous, vague, mystery, and the wind blows where it wills, and so on. And you have to understand that there is this element in the working of the Spirit, but that you also have 350 biblical references that tell a lot of specific things about the Spirit. And so one figure that captured my mind and imagination was the figure of the pouring of the Spirit. So that the Spirit is not a simple relation, but comes with this power of addressing multiple individuals, countries, languages, and bringing them into new unity. And this caught our imagination. Then we had the complicated topic, how can we speak of the person of the Spirit if the Spirit is not self-referential? And John Polkinghorn's genius insight was its context sensitivity. The Spirit is context sensitive. So we tried to work with a more elaborate notion of the Spirit, and this, of course, had an impact on understanding Christology. So recently I was able to offer a Christology which could bring Christ and the Spirit on one level, and the reign of God and the divine powers in Christ. And I'm now aiming at reaching out back to the creation topics. So that you start working with the Spirit and with Christology, and then try to, can we get in conversation with scientists new insights into the dynamics of creation? And here I listen with very sharp ears what you say and what Jeff says in the organization of complex animated life, anthropological life, the complexity of the body, cultural life, and so on. So in a way we are exploring with, not here faith, their knowledge. No, bringing it together, going at the resources of faith, then trying to discover more complex patterns of thinking and insight, and then reinvesting it in other areas. So in a way, the cousinly relation I really underline between theological and scientific research, and we should not fear this, and we can really explore it also when we work with our historical and textual resources.
I just had a very brief comment on the New Testament story of Pentecost. The pouring of the Spirit, for sure. That's not an all-enveloping ball of flame. It's divided flames resting on each individual.
Since Martin addressed questions to all three of you, Jeff, do you would in conclusion just like to add anything further?
Well, now, how has our concept of God changed in light of evolution? That's so manifold and different answers to different traditions. But I would like to make two observations that seem very widespread and also seem unavoidable. And one is the notion, this isn't a new idea, but it's a deepening of an existing idea, that the way God brings about his purposes in history is by honoring the constraints of history. And in some sense, there's if you take the evolutionary history seriously, I don't see how you can dodge the notion of, in some sense, a kenotic God who works his purposes out while honoring the constraints of the created world. And secondly, and this isn't just evolutionary theory, this is the discovery of natural history that's ensued from the mid-19th century on, is it really is the case that the notion of suffering has increased both in terms of its scope and in terms of its temporal priority. So here the notion of a cruciform creation and a God who suffers in and with us, I think, is amplified by the discoveries of evolutionary biology.
Thank you. There we must bring this session to an end. May we thank Michael, John, and Jeff for that stimulating.
Thank you. Pretty good.